tracking the amazing growth of the first century church to challenge and inspire the 21st century church. This is Unstoppable Church, Then and Now, recorded on location in Israel, Cyprus, Turkey, Greece, Malta and Italy. Bible teacher and church pastor Mike Beaumont is in conversation for the next 30 minutes with David Taverner.
We're continuing our conversation, Mike, here in ancient Corinth, looking over the amazing ruins, which are pretty extensive, and getting a sense of what life was like here in ancient Corinth when Paul came here. But he was writing to the Christians here from Ephesus, you were explaining last time. But this time we're sort of moving along in the first letter of Corinthians, and what are the kind of themes that come out?
Well, we're going to look today at chapters 5 to 11, where he picks up on some of the things that he talked about last time, or begun to hint at, about the need for Christians to live distinctly from the world around them. I used the illustration last time of the main road through the city, the Lycaon road that cut through all that happened on both sides of the city, temples, shops, bathing, whatever it might have been, and use that as a picture of how we as Christians are meant to walk through life, affecting that which is on either side of us rather than being affected by it. But there were several key areas that Paul had heard about, either from reports that had been brought to him, as we saw last time, or through questions that had been raised with him, that showed the Corinthians really hadn't understood at all this issue of needing to live as separated people, that is, distinct people. By that I don't mean, building a little hermitage somewhere and going living miles away from anywhere. That's not what Jesus had modelled. People had done that. In Israel, we saw in a previous episode at Qumran, they'd gone hidden away and kept themselves from the nasty world. And Jesus' model, no, real holiness is about living in the world, but living distinctly from it, separated from it, and yet influencing it by letting people see what life looks like when you come under the rule of King Jesus. The trouble is, in several areas in these chapters, the exact opposite had happened, and the spirit of this city of Corinth that was renowned for its immorality had fallen over into the church.
But just to be clear, this is a letter not to Corinth, to the people of Corinth, but a letter to the Christians in Corinth.
Yeah, this is not Paul trying to tell unbelievers how they ought to be living, which, let's face it, the church has tried to do sometimes, wag its finger at the world and told them off for not being godly. Well, how can you expect them to be godly when they haven't got God? So this is him addressing the church. And when you remember that, it sounds like you're stating the obvious, but when you remember that, it makes what he is about to say even more appalling.
For example?
Well, if we pick up in chapter 5, there's an issue of immorality that he addresses. Now, I know sometimes the church is seen as being, that's all you ever think about. Well, read the whole letter. Paul thinks about an awful lot, but this was a very real issue, and one that he was not prepared to sweep under the carpet just because, everybody does it these days, don't they? In fact, the issue of immorality in chapter 5 was so great that Paul said, frankly, even the pagan Corinthians would be shocked by it.
And that's saying something.
Absolutely. So why don't we read just the first few verses? It's actually reported, so this is part of the reports that he's heard, it's actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that does not even occur among pagans. A man has his father's wife, and you're proud. Shouldn't you rather have been filled with grief and have put out of your fellowship the man who did this? So even though I'm not physically present, I'm with you in spirit, and I've already passed judgment on the one who did this, just as if I were present. So when you are assembled in the name of our Lord Jesus, and I am with you in spirit, and the power of our Lord Jesus is present, hand this man over to Satan, so that the sinful nature may be destroyed, and his spirit saved on the day of the Lord.
So let's not beat about the bush. You're saying that in the Christian church in Corinth, a man has basically had sex with his stepmother.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why it's described as his father's wife rather than with his mother. So there was someone, an unknown person in the church who, had been having sex with his stepmother. And the thing is, rather than being ashamed of that, he was proud of it. He was showing people how free he was. I am so free in Jesus that, these old moral taboos don't matter anymore. And Paul's shock is not just at what this man has been doing, but that the church has not just tolerated it, they've become proud of it. Look how free we are in our church. We even allow things to happen that don't happen out there in supposedly free Corinth. Now, why were they saying that? It seems they got themselves in a bit of a theological mess here by sort of distinguishing body and spirit. And this was a problem that kept cropping up in the early church, that it's not our body that matters and what we do with the body. What really matters is our spirit. And, Christians have fallen into that in church history at times. I can remember when I first became a Christian, a little song called "Set My Spirit Free, that I might worship thee." But that's a very unbiblical picture. The Bible sees us as whole beings, body, mind, soul, spirit. And you can't separate bits off like that. But they were trying to, and they were becoming so proud. Look at how free we are. We are so free in our spirit that this guy can commit repeated sexual immorality with his stepmom. Not even pagans would do that, Paul says, in this city. And yet they were being proud of it.
So what's his practical suggestion to deal with it?
Well, it might sound a little bit shocking to us today, but he says, put this guy out the church. Put him outside of the membership of the church. Treat him as though he weren't a Christian anymore. Why? Because that's how he's behaving. So the whole point is to put him out of fellowship and membership with the church, not so he'll be lost. Paul's purpose is clearly redemptive. He wants him to be saved at the end. So he's saying, put him out of the church and do it with my full authority behind you. In fact, it's like I'm there in the spirit with you when you do this. Put him out, exercise church discipline, put him outside of the church because his behaviour belongs outside of the church. It does not belong in here. Now, yes, it sounds hard, but as I said, his purpose is redemptive. And by the way, by the time we get to 2 Corinthians, Paul is writing to the church about this guy, telling them it really is time that they welcomed him back now because he really has repented about it. So its purpose, had come to pass.
There'd never be a situation like that in church today, surely.
Well, I've seen some unusual situations in church, without a doubt, where you think, where on earth did this come from? Of course, we're very good at covering things up, aren't we? But God actually is very good at exposing things as well, which is why if we get in a mess, it's good to confess it quickly, because otherwise things just go from bad to worse. So sadly, this kind of thing can happen, does happen, where, let's widen it beyond just this sexual morality issue, but where the behaviour in the church is no different from and no better than the behaviour of godless society outside. And if that's the case, frankly, what on earth are you doing in church? You might as well go and join that lot because your behaviour belongs out there.
Does the church exercise discipline today?
Well, some do, and some don't. And I think, some over the years have, turned a blind eye to things, or if they have dealt with it, have dealt with it very quietly. And listen, I'm a great believer in dealing with things as privately as is appropriate. And if ever someone comes to me quickly and says, I have messed up, I'm not bothered how bad they have messed up. And I've heard some terrible things in my decades as a pastor. But the Bible tells us, in 1 John chapter 1, that if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves. But if we confess our sin, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sin and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. So that's why, if you mess up, maybe someone's listening today who's messed up, maybe in a sexual area, maybe in a financial area, go and find one of your church leaders and confess it quickly. Because then we can work with you to deal with this, rather than the thing growing and staying hidden and doing what it always does, then exploding as it gets worse and action having to be taken. Now, churches will have different policies on when and how and where they exercise discipline. And I think grace should abound. But the point comes when grace has to stop, when how you are living inside the church is no different to how those are living outside of the church.
Is one of the problems, though, that the church might have its policies, but the congregation don't know really what those policies are and have their own views?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I'll tell you what, I just got an email literally 3 or 4 days ago while we were here on this trip. Sounded a little bit hoity-toity, but it said, Mike, should someone be allowed to be baptized if they have committed fornication? A big old word there meaning sex outside of marriage. And I simply wrote back and said, absolutely, as long as they have repented. I don't care what they have committed, and I don't think God cares. But have they confessed it? Have they said, that was wrong, that is not compatible with my life in Christ? I repent of that. I turn away from that. Do you know what? You might even have to say, I've got a weakness in that area. Would you help me? Would you keep me accountable? Would you check up on me every week? Do whatever it needs to do. But anyway, I tried to be as gracious as I could to that message. And perhaps I should just add, why should it be dealt with? Well, Paul goes on to answer that in chapter 5 because he uses another picture. There's loads of pictures in this book. And he says, you see, it's a bit like yeast in dough. And if you put yeast in dough, it spreads. And the same thing is true in the church. So we've got to get rid of the yeast of sin. Don't leave it hoping it will sort itself out. Don't leave it hoping it will go away. It won't. It will spread, and it will spread through the church, and you'll end up with an even bigger problem.
So that was one key issue that Paul wanted to address. What was another key issue?
Yeah, another big one. I mean, I read this and I think, I can't believe this is happening. Here's this people who are supposed to be separated, as we've called this episode, different from the community of the world round about. But in chapter 6, the first thing we find in chapter 6 is that believers are issuing lawsuits against one another, taking one another to court. This is not a believer with a non-believer or vice versa. This is a brother or sister in the church taking another brother or sister to court over some issue. Paul is livid in this section. He says, for goodness sake, don't you know that one day, we're going to sit with Christ and judge things. We're going to judge angels. And you can't judge a little dispute like this. You would rather shame the church and take your disputes to the court down the street here? Can you not find in the church, a few wise people who could sit and arbitrate with you? So clearly, again, this was a reflection of the society round about. I said in our very first episode when we were here in Corinth, it was at a crossroads in the ancient world. So commerce was a big thing here. Making money was a big thing. Does that remind you of any cultures today? Making money was a big thing. Making money was the big thing. And the Christians had got caught up in that. Sadly, a lot of Christians have got caught up in that today, making money. Of course, we always add, I'm doing it for the family. I'm doing it for the kids. Actually, we're doing it for ourselves, to make ourselves feel better. So they got caught up in this, and it looks like the lawsuit, was something to do with some business thing out there. But Paul just says, you know what, the very fact that you've got lawsuits among you shows you've been defeated already. Frankly, it would be better to be wronged and out of pocket than take a brother or sister to court like you're doing.
There's no doubt that the culture that was all around these Christians here in ancient Corinth was non-stop, incessant, and very difficult, I guess, to deal with. What was another issue that Paul had to address from a distance in Ephesus?
Well, do you know what? He will come back to the issue of sexual immorality, sort of more generally, rather than that specific issue at the end of chapter 6. And again, it's because of this thing of some Christians feeling they were free to do anything physical, because it was only the spiritual aspect of them that mattered. And so he'll come back to the issue of sexual immorality, and he sums it up in one sentence: the body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. Now, Paul has no problems with sex per se, but the right place for it, he and the Bible makes clear, is in the covenant of marriage between one man and one woman for life. But here, they were sleeping around with anybody and everybody. Why? Because they were walking down this road again, taking in the atmosphere of the city round about them. Now, I've referred previously to the temple of Aphrodite that was perched up on top of the Corinth, this great rock outcrop that towers.
Like a mountain, really, isn't it?
It is, really, looking at it from here. It's huge. And up there now, as you and I are looking, there's the remains of a much later fortress on top. But imagine up there, there's this temple of Aphrodite that you would see for miles around. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, full of temple prostitutes. So you went up there to worship God by having sex with a prostitute. Well, let's face it, that could seem very attractive, couldn't it, to many people? And the sad thing is that the Corinthians seem to have got caught up in that as well. They thought they could still continue to do that. And he'll actually say to them at one point, shall I take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Don't you know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it said, the two will become one flesh. So flee sexual immorality. All other sins a man commits are outside his body, but he who sins sexually sins against his own body. And don't you know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you've received from God? You're not your own. You were bought at a price. So honor God with your body. And they certainly weren't doing that. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about this is, and I know, Christians can get accused of, you get so uptight about sex, you Christians. The only thing we do is, it's just one of a whole range of things that God says is good, but in its right place. And, today, if we bring it up to date today, for many people today, sex is simply a recreational pastime.
You hear this phrase, casual sex.
Yeah.
Is there such a thing?
No, I don't think there is really, because Paul says when you join yourself with someone like that, something happens. It's not just your bodies that have joined. Something has happened at a spiritual connection level that you might never see. So the thought that, it's casual sex or that it's harmless fun, that's the other phrase that you hear sometimes. It's harmless fun provided you don't hurt anybody else. How many times have I heard that? Well, actually, the main person you're hurting, besides the other person, is you. You're damaging something about your own heart and body. So Paul really challenges them in that area to come back to God's design for sex and its place, that it's within marriage, the marriage of one man and one woman for life. And what if we've messed up in that area? Well, if you tell me you have, you won't be the first person to have told me that. Confess it to Jesus, because there's nothing that he can't forgive. But just like he said to that woman caught in adultery one day, he forgave her and then said, go and sin no more.
So clearly sex is a big thing here in ancient Corinth. What about other things associated with life here?
Well, one of the big things here was really the issue of idolatry. Now, we fail to understand really what idolatry is all about. We think of idolatry, a little wooden or stone statue that people bow down to or, bring an offering to. But idolatry had much deeper connotations, both in the Old Testament, where Baal worship was one of the big issues, highly sexualized worship there too. But it was a big issue in places like Corinth, because offering sacrifices to idols was very, very tied up with the business world. You see, we've already said that there are temples all around here, particularly as we look across here to that great temple of Apollo. And one of the things that used to happen is in business, if you were making a business deal, I mean, what do you do today to make a business deal? Well, the classic thing is, let's shake on it. Then if you're wise, you put it in writing and you both sign, of course. But we've got a certain way of sealing the deal. Well, one of the ways, the main way that you did that in this culture at that time was to go to the temple together, to go to, say, Apollo's temple, if he was the god of the person you were doing a business deal with. And the guy would offer up a sacrifice, pay for the sacrifice to be offered to Apollo, and then the meat that came from that sacrifice would be turned into a dinner, and you would have what we would call a business dinner together.
Right.
And in eating that meal together, you'd sort of shake hands on it. So Christians here in Corinth who were in business were sort of being pulled two ways. And it's clear from when you read chapter 8 that some of them were saying, well, look, I see no problem in going to the temple of Apollo for the sake of a business deal. Why? Because there's no such thing as Apollo. There's no such thing as a power behind an idol. It's a piece of stone. And if they're stupid enough to believe it, what do I care? I don't believe it. So it has no power, no reality. I don't mind doing it. Others in the church were saying, whoa, hang on a minute. It might just be a piece of stone and wood, but there are demonic powers behind that. And in participating in it, you are opening yourself up to getting those demonic powers starting to influence your life. So once again, huge divisions coming into the church. And how did they deal with this? What were they going to do? What do you do, for example, if you're invited to a meal? It's another example Paul gives. You're invited to a meal. There you are, just about to tuck into this gorgeous piece of lamb, and someone comes up and says, excuse me, do you know that's been offered to an idol? And they think they're doing you a favor. They know you're a Christian. What do? Do you say, oh, don't be stupid? Well, the poor old person feels very demeaned then. Or do you say, thanks so much for telling me? Well, actually, Paul's pretty pragmatic here, and he says, in that context, you would be better avoiding the meat for the sake of conscience. And he says, I don't mean your conscience, I mean theirs. Because they meant it well. So honour and respect that. What about the business meals? Well, he sets out both sides, and he says at one level, yeah, we know there is no such thing as an idol. But not everybody knows that. And we do have to face up to the fact that behind every non-Christian religion, at the end of the day, lie demonic powers in some form or other. And so, in participating in a meal like this, you really are opening yourself up. So he's trying to find a wise, pragmatic way of healing some of the divisions. But his main thing through all of that is the call to be distinct, is the call to be different. And it's interesting, he doesn't lay down a rule and say, right, you can't do this. He lays down the parameters and says, it may be okay in some circumstances, like in someone's home, but it may not, and you need to think about this. So the key issue for Paul here is not what it was, but where it was. If this meal took place in the temple of Apollo, not sure that's such a good idea. But if it took place in someone's home with meat that happened to have been sacrificed to Apollo and then was sold in the market, which is what happened, hey, who's going to lose on that? And I think sometimes still as Christians today, we can't always lay a law down because Jesus didn't teach something about this. So we have to try and take his principles and wisely apply them. But we need to do that together. Because if we do it on your own, I'll tell you what will happen. Each of us will come up with an interpretation that suits what I want. But when we look at these things together, we get a combined wisdom of the Lord together and are much more likely to come up with the right and good answer.
It sounds like he's also addressing this significant area, I think, of perception, the perception from others towards your behaviour.
Yeah, absolutely. That really is a key part in his whole argument there. How will this look to others? And we do have to stop and think about that. It's not just what we think about it. How will this come across to others? And of course, that's still highly relevant for today as well.
Relationships, I guess, in a city like this, 500,000 people, thereabouts, about 500,000 people lived here. It's a big city at that time. Relationships were important, and marriage as well. So what does Paul say about that? Because people have got probably different understandings of Paul's view on marriage.
Yeah, right in the heart of this, in chapter 7, Paul has got a lengthy section about marriage. And yeah, some people have badly misunderstood Paul and given him a bad press, because chapter 7 begins with the words, "Now for the matters you wrote about." So the first 6 chapters are about the reports you've had from Chloe's people. But from chapter 7 onwards, several times we'll get him saying, "Now, what you wrote about this." So he's answering questions that they asked. Trouble is, of course, we don't know what the question was. We can try and work backwards, but we've got to be careful. So he says, "Now for the matters you wrote about, it's good for a man not to marry." And historically, people have thought that's what Paul was saying. Now for the matters you asked me about, yes, right, it's good not to marry, as though they'd asked, is it good to marry, Paul? Whereas pretty much every New Testament scholar now would say, well, actually, that's in the equivalent of inverted commas. They didn't have punctuation in New Testament Greek. But it's almost certainly Paul quoting here what they had said. Now, for the matters you wrote about, number 1, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. In other words, not to get married. And again, he's quite pragmatic here in many ways. He says, on the one hand, because there is so much immorality, particularly in a city like this, each man ought to have his own wife and each woman ought to have her own husband, and they ought to have a full and complete sexual relationship between them. And the sexual side only ought to be put to one side, by agreement with one another. But then come together again, because we don't want you to be tempted. And then he'll go on to say from verse 8, what about the unmarried and the widows? And he'll actually say that, do you know what? It might be good for you to remain unmarried, because these are pretty evil days and there's a lot of work to be done. And if you remain unmarried, or if you remain as a widow or widower, you've got opportunity to serve the Lord, because you've not got a lot of the responsibilities that married people have. But hey, do you know what? If you want to marry, that's fine. You go ahead and do so, because both marriage and singleness can be states that are incredibly blessed by the Lord. The one thing that can't be blessed by the Lord, he'll say in this chapter, is living as a married person while still being single. And it seems that some of the Corinthians were trying to be very super spiritual and say, the Lord's called me to celibacy, but then were nipping up the Acro Corinth, to have their way with some of the temple prostitutes up there. And Paul says there is no value in that at all. That's a completely godless thing. So singleness can be highly honoured, but if you're going to be single, please be genuinely single. And if you're going to be married, be genuinely married, because both can have the blessing of the Lord. So in marriage and singleness, again, there's a real call here to live in a separated way from this culture where, frankly, you couldn't tell who was married and who wasn't at times, because a man might be married, but it was accepted in Roman culture, that his wife was for having kids. And if he wanted fun, he went out and found a prostitute somewhere. So Paul's saying, no, we're living differently to that, whether married or single. There's a way of living that's really Christ-honouring.
So where relationships are working well, that has an impact on the growth of the church.
Oh, absolutely. And these days in the 21st century in the West, society is breaking up, family is breaking up. It's often unusual to find the traditional, mum, dad with X number of kids. And in saying that, I'm not demeaning anyone, who is not in that state. But, the whole of society is getting fragmented and broken up. What a powerful testimony, therefore, to live out family life, to live out business life, to live out morality life in a way that is clear and clean and distinct and Christ-honouring, that shows it works. We're not doing this so we can go around sort of saying, oh, look at me. we're doing this because we want people to say, my goodness, you've got a great marriage, haven't you? You brought your kids up well, haven't you? And that could apply to single mums these days and single dads. But we want the world to be able to look at us and see that, living in a separated way from the culture around, living in a different way is not just a different way, it's a better way. And it's when we live that better way that we definitely see more of unstoppable church.
Mike Beaumont and David Taverner, travelling from Jerusalem to Rome and beyond to track the amazing growth of the first century church and what that means for the unstoppable church of the 21st century. There are more Bible podcasts from Mike and David on the UCB Player app and major podcast platforms. Check out Jesus Then and Now or Bible Books in 30 Minutes.